Hi, everyone. This is Paula Garrett, and welcome to NCJW webinar, which is Weaponizing White Supremacy During COVID-19. My name is Paula Garrett, and I am the Assistant Treasurer of the National Council of Jewish Women's National Board, soon to be the Treasurer. I'm also a member of NCJW Pittsburgh, and my pronouns are she and her. As you know, the National Council of Jewish Women has launched a weekly seminar series to give our advocates across the country tools to stay connected to NCJW, to reframe our work, and to advance the Jewish values that drive our work. We are in the 5th week of our series today, and will continue every Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time through May. The series will be recorded, posted online, and shared widely for those who cannot attend in person. It will include advocacy, service, technical assistance, and paths to staying connected during these very difficult times. White supremacists and far-right extremists are taking advantage of the coronavirus pandemic to peddle disinformation and hate online, and to plan real-world terror. Today, we are joined by NCJW leader Kathy Cantor, as well as Integrity First for America Executive Director Amy Spitalnik and leading litigator Roberta Kaplan, the team prosecuting the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists responsible for the Charlottesville violence. To understand the current landscape of hate and to learn how to identify disinformation and to push back against bigotry. Before I introduce the speakers in more detail, here is some housekeeping. After all, this is NCJW. You'll notice everybody's mics are muted and cameras are turned off. This is intentional to keep the focus on our speakers this afternoon. Feel free to drop questions into the chat box as we go along. We'll have time for Q&A after the presentation from Integrity First for America. If you're having problems, please reach out to Ari at asolomon@ncjw.org or write in the chat if you are experiencing ongoing technical issues. But please note our limited capacity to address issues while the webinar is running. This webinar features closed captioning. Just click on the CC or closed caption button on the bottom of your screen to turn this feature on and off. One more general reminder, we are recording this webinar and we'll upload it to our website. So with that, I'll turn the webinar over to Kathy Cantor, who has served for the past 8 years as co-SPA for Michigan, a national NCJW appointment. Kathy will talk about her work to combat white supremacy in her community. Kathy?
I'm here. Thanks, Paula. I am really delighted to have the opportunity today to talk to you about a group called Women Confronting Racism. I want to tell you the history of this organization. In October of 2017, the city of Detroit hosted the first women's convention in over 40 years. Over 5,000 people from all over the country converged on Cobo Hall to strategize, learn, and bond. On the last day of the convention, the organizers had us gather in caucuses to connect and share our contact information with the goal of continuing our conversations on race and privilege. One local woman reached out to that list a few months later to ask if there was any interest in continuing the discussion regarding confronting white womanhood. I offered our NCJW boardroom for the first meeting, and 2 years later, that is still our home. About 10 women got together for the first meeting. The group coalesced from the very start. Within a few meetings, our number had grown to a core group of around 20, and we had come up with a name, Women Confronting Racism, and a mission statement. The mission of Women Confronting Racism is to help white women examine our own implicit and explicit biases, which enable and reinforce systemic cultural racism within our families and communities. We were actually able to plan and execute our first conference only a few months later. On May 11, 2018, our conference titled Confronting Racism Within, History, Systems, Community, and Self was held at a local college. It was attended by 107 people. Our opening keynote speaker was Dr. Peter J. Hammer, professor at Wayne State University Law School and director of the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. Dr. Hammer explored the manner in which belief systems and institutions interact in Detroit's narrative on race. The day was concluded with Dr. Dee Dee Coleman, pastor of Russell Street Missionary Baptist Church in Detroit, who shared her thoughts around the iconic promise, "We shall overcome." Between the two keynotes, we offered 8 breakout sessions which provided participants an opportunity to select 2 workshops from offerings including civil discourse, implicit bias, microaggression, white fragility, cultural identity, and intersectionality. We received very positive feedback from that first conference, indicating to us that we were on the right track. Following up on this community interest, we joined with a local church to offer 3 two-hour workshops in December. The topics were civil discourse, white fragility, and intersectionality. About 45 people attended each session. Our second conference was the following May, held at the same local college. We had about 70 people join us for the day in an open space style conference. If you're not familiar with that type of conference, I can recommend it, as it provided us with the tools we needed to have an impactful and meaningful day. We began the day with Sawatu Salama Ra, a Detroit environmental and racial justice organizer who was arrested and jailed while pregnant and forced to give birth to her son in prison. Ms. Ra's topic was intersectionality, which was the theme of the conference. Following the keynote, the conference attendees gathered in a circle and were given paper and markers. Everyone was given an opportunity to write a discussion topic on a sheet of paper and place it in the center of the circle. Once all the topics were suggested, they were taped on a wall and assigned a room and a time. Participants were encouraged to go to whatever discussion group they wished, and when time was called, the participants moved to a second discussion. There were 3 discussion sessions with lunch in between. The feedback for that conference was also tremendously positive. People generally felt empowered to speak up and participate in ways that traditional workshops may not encourage. And they left having a deeper understanding of how whiteness plays out in a daily context and what we need to do to begin to unlearn our own biases. We were prepared for our third conference, which would have been held this Friday. We postponed it and have tentative plans to run the same conference next year. In the meantime, we're in discussions about creating a webinar for the late fall, the topic to be Disparity in Healthcare in Michigan Exposed, with discussion on why COVID-19 is disproportionately taking lives of African Americans in Michigan. Our group continues to forge ahead, putting together a website, getting our incorporation documents in order, after which we will apply for 501c3 status. We still have about 20 active members with an email list of over 150 people who want to be kept informed of events, programs, and conferences. We continue to work on educating and understanding ourselves and offering the same to others. Thanks again for giving me the opportunity to tell you about women confronting racism.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks for sharing your work with us. Very impressive. Next, we'll hear from Amy Spotolnik and Robbie Kaplan. They both have very impressive biographies, but given our limited time, I'm going to share just a little bit about each presenter. Robbie Kaplan, is the founding partner at Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink, a limited liability partnership, and she's a formidable litigator with decades of experience in both commercial and civil rights legislation. She is perhaps best known for representing Edith Windsor in the landmark case, United States versus Windsor, in which the Supreme Court held that a key provision of the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional, landing the first major victory in the battle for marriage equality. Amy is the executive director of Integrity First for America, a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization dedicated to holding those accountable who threaten longstanding principles of our democracy, including our country's commitment to civil rights and equal justice. IFA is backing Sines versus Kessler, which is a landmark federal lawsuit filed by a coalition of Charlottesville community members against the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, and the hate groups responsible for the August 2017 violence. Robert Kaplan and another litigator, Karen Dunn, are partnering with Integrity First for America in this lawsuit. The trial is scheduled for later this year in October of 2020. Robbie, Amy.
Thank you so much, Paula, and thank you to Sheila and Faith and everyone at NCJW for making this possible. It's really a thrill to be here. As you can see, it is just me currently. Robbie should be joining us momentarily, hopefully in the next 15 or so minutes. She was pulled into a client crisis, and part of the hazards of working with two of the country's top litigators, Robbie and Karen, means that they are often dealing with last-minute crises, and we learn to adapt and make do when it comes to these crazy schedules. But we are thrilled to be here. I'm going to start by sharing a bit about the landscape of white supremacy in the United States, certainly well before we got to coronavirus, and especially during coronavirus, where we've only seen extremism rise. And then I'll dive into the work that we are doing here at IFA in partnership with our legal team. I suspect Robbie will be on certainly in time to discuss some of the genesis of the case and some of the anecdotes of litigating against these Nazis. But there's so much to say here. I suspect we'll have no shortage of conversation to be had over the next 45 minutes or so. As a few folks have said, feel free to drop questions into the chat. We will have a formal Q&A later in the conversation. And if you can't hear me, if there are any issues with the technical side of things, I know there's closed captioning, please just let us know. I am also going to share my screen for a moment so that I can share a few slides with you all, which will illustrate what we're talking about here today. Great. There we go. So I think it's hard to look at the last few years in this country and not see how white nationalism and white supremacy truly is one of the gravest threats to our national security, to the Jewish community, and to so many other minority communities in the United States. From Charlottesville to Pittsburgh to Poway to El Paso, and we'll certainly dive into those attacks and the connections between them. It's hard to ignore the crisis that white supremacy has posed, the deadly destruction it's brought to our communities. But if you look at the sort of attention it's been given by law enforcement, it hasn't compared. And so I'm seeing a few chats that people can't see the screen. So are folks still having problems seeing the screen? Okay, most people seem to see it. So we are going to continue here, and certainly happy to share the slides with folks afterwards. Thanks for flagging that. And it's good to at least have the chat so we can check in. And so, as I said, white supremacy, white nationalism is very clearly a crisis. I think none of you would be on the call if you didn't recognize that already. It is worth understanding some of the numbers. The Anti-Defamation League has done really important research on the rise of white supremacy and hate in recent years. In 2018, right-wing extremists killed more people than any year since 1995. 1995 is the year of the Oklahoma City bombing. We just marked the 25th anniversary of that white supremacist attack in which Timothy McVeigh blew up the federal office building in Oklahoma City. I think at the time, many of us were shocked and appalled by that something like that could happen in our country. I remember vividly watching news coverage of that when I was a child, and it informed so much of my own sort of thinking about domestic terrorism and about hate and what people were capable of. But at the same time, many of us probably thought of it as an isolated incident. And for some time, it largely was. We didn't see the level of far-right white supremacist terrorism that we've seen in recent years. But over the last few years, we have seen a surge in white supremacist violence and anti-Semitic violence and in other forms of far-right extremism. Anti-Semitic incidents have surged 99% in the 3-year period between 2015 and 2018. We are just beginning to get good numbers for 2019, and we know that they were not much better than 2018. Nearly all murders by domestic extremists had ties to right-wing extremism, in many cases involving white supremacy. And then, of course, we know anecdotally what those attacks look like. We know about Pittsburgh and the Tree of Life attack, Poway, which we just marked the 1-year anniversary of, El Paso, which is coming up this August, the 1-year anniversary. And I think what's important to note is that in many cases, or rather in all of these cases, these attacks are not isolated incidents. They're part of a much larger cycle of white supremacist violence in America, a much larger cycle in which each attack is used to inspire the next one. And as we've seen over and over again, Charlottesville really has been at the root of this cycle of white supremacist violence. It's the flashpoint that served as a rallying cry and as a marker, or sort of a stake in the ground, that really was a sign of what was to come when it came to the rise of violent extremism. And really, again, served as a rallying cry for so many of these white supremacists and inspired many to action. So before we dive into the work that we're doing at Integrity First for America and the Charlottesville case, I think it's also worth talking about how this all translates to this moment. I think no one will be surprised to know that in moments of crises, extremists look towards communities to serve as scapegoats. This is a tale as old as time, and often the Jewish community has been squarely in the center of these efforts. What's happening during coronavirus is no different than what's happened through countless other crises, but we are dealing with factors at play here, including social media and the internet, that make it ever more dangerous and really underscore this broader threat of white supremacist violence that we've been grappling with. And so starting in January, when coronavirus first came up as essentially a threat, potential threat, many of us might not have been paying attention to it in the same way that we certainly are now. But starting even in January, we would see these white supremacists on their online platforms talking about how this might be part of a Jewish conspiracy. Was Israel withholding a vaccine? On, and you could imagine the types of conspiracy theories that they promote. Many of which have to do with something called replacement theory. The idea is that the Jews are the puppet masters behind a larger effort to essentially cause white genocide, to replace the white race. And we'll talk about this in the context of Charlottesville and so many of these other attacks in a few moments. But we see these conspiracy theories starting to percolate online as early as January. Similarly, and we've all seen these terrifying numbers, anti-Asian conspiracy attacks immediately started increasing as coronavirus started spreading around the globe. And there's been stunning numbers coming out of various communities across the United States in which these are not just anti-Asian rhetoric and slurs and other things along those lines, but actual attacks on Asian Americans. And in many of these cases, we can trace them back to these white supremacist sites in which these same sort of conspiracy theories echo so much of what these white supremacists were saying. And again, you can imagine what many of these conspiracies are. These are the same sorts of ideas, that there is some sort of broader force making coronavirus into a global conspiracy, that the Jews, that the Asians are responsible for essentially causing coronavirus, creating it, blocking the release of a vaccine. At the same time, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, there's some cognitive dissonance here in that many of these same people also, of course, don't believe in the social distancing measures that our government is rightfully promoting. And so there's an interesting juxtaposition there that we'll talk about in just a second. But not long after these conspiracy theories started percolating online, much like in every incidence of white supremacist violence, we saw it begin to turn into real world violence. So in early March, there were reports that white supremacists planned to turn the virus into a bioweapon that they would target at Jews, at law enforcement, and others. They used a social media platform called Discord, which is favored by many of the defendants in our Charlottesville suit and many of their supporters. Sorry, not Discord, Telegram. Telegram is sort of the current white supremacist platform of choice. Of course, a few weeks after that, this continued. A white supremacist in Missouri tried to bomb a hospital that was treating coronavirus patients. Thankfully, he was stopped by the FBI. He died in an interaction with the FBI. The details have not been fully released at this point. But certainly, every piece of evidence points to the fact that he was deeply entrenched in these white supremacist social media sites. And in fact, it later came out that he is a member of National Socialist Movement, which is one of the neo-Nazi hate group defendants in our Charlottesville suit. And a few weeks after that, we learned that a white supremacist in Massachusetts tried to burn down a Jewish assisted living facility in Western Massachusetts. Thankfully, he was not successful. The FBI in Boston arrested him a few weeks ago. But over and over again, we've seen how these online comments, these online threats quickly turn into real world violence, in which these white supremacists, inspired by these conspiracy theories online, take them and try to take action in the name of taking on the Jews, in the name of accelerating the collapse of our society, which is an ideology that the would-be hospital bomber shared, something called accelerationism, that essentially believes that we need to take on our institutions like hospitals and other key places in order to accelerate the collapse of our society. And so what we're seeing during coronavirus is really an amplification of the same trends and patterns that we've seen over and over again for the last few years when it comes to white supremacy. The same conspiracy theories, the same structure, the same MO as we saw from Charlottesville to Pittsburgh to Poway to El Paso and beyond. And so it's worth understanding what happened in Charlottesville and the connections between these attacks as we think about how we actually take on this broader wave of white supremacist violence. It's easy to forget right now. 2.5 years ago feels like 17 lifetimes ago in this moment. But 2.5 years ago, neo-Nazis and white supremacists descended on an American city, on Charlottesville, Virginia, for a weekend of violence. I'm just making sure that everyone can actually hear me because I see a few people having trouble. Great. 2.5 years ago, 2.5 years ago, white supremacists and neo-Nazis descended on Charlottesville for this weekend of violence. Many of us know the image that you see on your screen, this tiki torch march, in which these neo-Nazis marched military style on the University of Virginia, carrying torches meant to be evocative of the Nazis and the KKK. They chanted things like "Jews will not replace us," "Blood and soil," and "White lives matter." They surrounded a group of peaceful counter-protesters at the Thomas Jefferson statue, and they threw lit torches, fuel, and other things at the protesters while beating them up and punching them. One of our plaintiffs who was there that evening said he thought he was going to die. A few blocks away, a reverend, who's actually also a plaintiff in our lawsuit, was holding an interfaith gathering meant to give people a safe place to come and to fight back against the hate that was coming to their communities. Unfortunately, that gathering had to end up sheltering in place and eventually evacuating out the back because they too were under threat from the neo-Nazis that had the surprise rally at the University of Virginia that night. And if you look at the chats, they talked about buying tiki torches from various places so not to alert the community to the fact that they were planning this rally. We knew that they were going to be there on Saturday, August 12th, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this Tiki Torch March was intended to be a surprise attack on the University of Virginia and the Charlottesville community, again, evocative of the Nazis and the KKK with the torches that they carried and the slogans that they chanted and so much more. And then, of course, the next day, the cycle of violence continued. We all know how the day ultimately culminated with the car attack. But what's important to understand is that that was truly the culmination of a much larger weekend of violence. These neo-Nazis and white supremacists descended on downtown Charlottesville this time. They were there under the guise of protesting the removal of a Confederate statue of Robert E. Lee, which was in a park now known as Emancipation Park. But they were not there to actually protest the removal of a Confederate statue. They were there to bring violence and hate to Charlottesville. They surrounded the Jewish synagogue, which is a few blocks away from the park. They chanted Sieg Heil and carried semi-automatic weapons, and on their social media sites that day, talked about torching those Jewish monsters. One of the details that sticks with me most is the fact that not only did congregants have to be evacuated out the back of the synagogue during Shabbat services, but so too did the Torahs, including a Holocaust scroll that had been saved from Nazi Germany in the 40s and was again under Nazi threat in America in 2017. And that detail gets me every time. And then, of course, we know how the day culminated with James Fields driving his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring many others, including many of our plaintiffs. And I'm going to skip ahead to this photo here, which I imagine many of you remember. This is the Pulitzer-winning photo of Fields' attack on the crowd of peaceful counter-protesters. And in it, you can see many of our plaintiffs. The back of the car, you could see Marcus Martin wearing red sneakers and a white tank top. He had just pushed his then fiance, now wife, Marissa, out of the way of the oncoming car. They both suffered extensive injuries. Marcus's leg was shattered. He suffered a concussion and other injuries. On the front of the car, you can see another one of our plaintiffs, Thomas Baker, wearing a gray t-shirt, and he has a lower back tattoo, as you can see. He too suffered extensive injuries, as did many of our other plaintiffs who were hit by the car, but you can't see in this photo, someone such as Natalie Romero, whose skull was fractured. And there's another, I think, award-winning news photo of her sitting on the curb, blood gushing down her face following the attack. Some of these are so graphic that we try not to show them during these presentations, at least without a warning. And what's important to understand here is that none of this was an accident. What happened in Charlottesville was not spontaneous, it was not accidental, and it was not a mistake. It was planned for months in advance by these neo-Nazis and white supremacists on social media, much like so many of these subsequent white supremacist attacks. And if you look at the chats from a website called Discord, which really are the basis of our lawsuit, they detail these this pre-planning in such meticulous detail, it's stunning. So they talked about everything from what to wear, what's the best way to sew a swastika onto a flag, how can I use my weapons in a way that make them look like just free speech tools, how are we going to crack commie skulls, should we put mayonnaise on our sandwiches for lunch because it might spoil in the sun, should we get gluten-free bread, and then of course talking about is it legal to run over protesters blocking roadways? Quote, I'm not just shitposting, I would like clarification. And they went so far as to create an image of what they described as John Deere's new multi-lane protester digester, showing a tractor that they intended to plow over protesters with. These posts were on July 17th, 2017, less than a month before these neo-Nazis and white supremacists descended on Charlottesville and did exactly as they promised, plowing over protesters with a car, and so much more in terms of the weekend of violence that I described. And so, again, none of this was an accident. And these chats really illustrate the intentional, meticulous way in which this violence was planned. And so on behalf of 10 community members who were injured in the violence, many of whom I described earlier, we are taking to court the 24 neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for this violence. I suspect many of you know some of these folks. Richard Spencer, he would frequently tour college campuses, coming across as the polished Nazi, spreading his hate. Andrew England, Chris Cantwell, Jason Kessler, Matthew Heimbach, the list goes on. And then of course our defendants also include the hate groups responsible. Identity Europa, League of the South, Vanguard America, which now goes by Patriot Front, and a number of Ku Klux Klan groups, among others. What's interesting here is that among other civil rights statutes, our case is using something quite literally called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, a statute that was passed nearly 150 years ago to protect recently freed slaves from Klan vigilante violence in the South, and has been used a number of times since to protect victims of hate crimes. It's one of the few statutes that give private plaintiffs a right of action against those responsible for undermining their civil rights. And we think that it truly is the perfect statute to take on these extremists right now, not only because we are literally suing some Ku Klux Klan groups with a statute called the Ku Klux Klan Act, but what this act is meant to do is protect against racially motivated violent conspiracies, which is exactly what we saw in Charlottesville. The meticulous planning that went into what happened there, the deliberate nature in which they talked about everything from cracking skulls and plowing over protesters with cars before they actually went to Charlottesville and did that, targeting people based on their race, their religion, and their willingness to stand up for others' civil rights. That is the definition of a racially motivated violent conspiracy. So we're taking these groups to court and these individuals to court. Our trial is scheduled for October of this year. We are proceeding full steam ahead. If you looked at the court docket in the case, you would have no idea that a pandemic was going on because our legal team has been tireless, filing motions to compel, motions to sanction these defendants left and right and ensure that they're held accountable to their obligations. And this case is so important for so many reasons. We believe that our plaintiffs deserve justice for the violence that they lived through. We believe that the Charlottesville community also deserves justice, and that all of those responsible for planning this violence must face accountability. Not just James Fields, who drove the car and is sitting in jail for the rest of his life, which is important, but the 24 individuals and groups who meticulously planned this violence in advance must be held accountable for the violence that they planned and executed. But this case is also important because it truly is the only effort in the country right now to use our justice system to take on the broad leadership of this violent movement. And that's where it comes back to the rise of extremism we're seeing right now. As I mentioned earlier, none of these white supremacist attacks and threats that we're seeing during coronavirus or before are an accident. They're part of a much larger cycle of violence in which each attack is used to inspire the next one, and in which many of these white supremacist leaders that we're taking on in our case are oftentimes at the center of the efforts to promote the violence. So a few examples. Robert Bauer, the Pittsburgh shooter who killed 11 at Tree of Life about a year and a half ago in Pittsburgh, communicated on Gab, a right-wing hate site, with some of the Charlottesville leaders before his attack. A few months after that, in Christchurch, New Zealand, a white supremacist opened fire on Muslims praying in mosque. Dozens were killed. That shooter painted onto his gun a symbol known as the hashtag, first popularized by Matthew Heimbach, another one of our defendants. And in turn, the Christchurch attack was used to inspire the Poway and the El Paso attacks, in which first a synagogue was targeted in Poway, California, and then by a white supremacist, and then a few months later, a white supremacist drove 10 hours out of his way to a Walmart in a predominantly Latino community to target that community. In all of these attacks, we've seen the same exact conspiracy theories we've seen on the rise in recent weeks, notably replacement theory, the idea that the Jews are the puppet masters behind this broader replacement of the white race. For example, if you look at the Pittsburgh shooter's manifesto, he chose Tree of Life because they partnered with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, to support refugees of all backgrounds. And as replacement theory argues, the Jews are the puppet masters who are bringing in immigrants, bringing in refugees to this country, and quote unquote trying to replace the white race. And so seeing how these conspiracy theories pan out from event to event, and the deep connections in which in so many of these cases, the defendants in our lawsuit are at the center of this broader cycle of violence, is really important to understand, because our case can uniquely do something about it. By going after these individuals and groups, we could take them on and win large civil judgments against them that can effectively bankrupt and dismantle these organizations and groups. We're already seeing the impact. Richard Spencer has talked about how he can no longer operate under business as usual because of our lawsuit. League of the South was unable to open a new headquarters because of the case. And just a few months ago, our team had neo-Nazi leader Elliot Klein, who sometimes goes by Eli Mosley, thrown in jail and sanctioned thousands of dollars. And so when we go to trial and win these large civil judgments against them, this fall will have ripple effects that go well beyond Charlottesville, effectively bankrupting them, dismantling their ability to operate, and making a major dent in the white supremacist movement's ability to operate. By no means is this a silver bullet. There's so much more that must be done when it comes to white supremacy and when it comes to our policymakers, law enforcement, the private sector, especially social media companies. But we believe that this case can uniquely make an impact on the in a financial and legal way on the leaders and groups that are at the center of this movement. And right now, as we see white supremacist terror on the rise during coronavirus, have a particularly powerful impact on a crisis that has gone underfunded and under-resourced for so long. There's so much more to say here, including about the role of the federal government. And I know that there were already questions in chat and folks who, I see a lot of questions in chat, and we'll try to work our way through those. And Robbie should be jumping on shortly, hopefully, as soon as she's done dealing with her client crisis. But let me try to work my way through some of these questions here, and I will also defer to Faith and to Ari and the best way to do Q&A to ensure that everyone can actually be heard and seen. And
Sure. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Kathy, for your remarks. I've been keeping track of questions that have come in via the chat, via the Q&A button. I'm doing my best. We have so many. I wanted to start by, again, thanking our presenters so much and acknowledging that we have more than 300 advocates on today's webinar, and it's just really exciting. It's hard for us as presenters because we only see each other, so I just wanted to share that.
incredible.
It is, and if for some reason, Robbie, if you're on here already, and please chat to all panelists that you're on so we know what account to give video and audio access to. So I might repeat that in a few minutes if she joins.
And I'm also asking her to text me if she joins.
Perfect.
Because she's having technical difficulties.
So we have so many questions. Let's get started, not to make you do two things at once. So the first is sort of a combination question and mea culpa. And the mea culpa is just from me. And it is this, I was so excited planning this webinar and working with these amazing speakers. And we've talked a lot about anti-Semitism and white supremacy, but I do want to acknowledge and apologize for the fact that our panelists are all amazing white women. That's a mea culpa, and I apologize. I should have been more thoughtful when I put together this panel, but I thought it could provide a good opportunity to ask this question. And it is, why is it crucial for us to work with and be led by people of color in the fight against white supremacy? Amy, if you have any thoughts or ways in which your organization has partnered, I would love to hear that. Thank you.
That's a fantastic question, and one that we think about quite often as well. I think it's important, and I think so many folks know this from that work that you're doing through NCJW and elsewhere. We can't take on one form of hate without taking on all forms of hate. And if you look at the ideology of these white supremacists, they truly hate all of us. They might be motivated at their core by anti-Semitism, the oldest form of hate, as many of us know, but that anti-Semitism is deeply intertwined with their racism, with their xenophobia, with their homophobia, with their misogyny, with everything else that they believe. And you see that firsthand in some of their conspiracy theories, like the replacement theory that I described earlier, in which they hate all of us. They believe that the Jews are the puppet masters responsible for all these other groups they hate gaining any power or stature in our society. But they truly hate all of us. And we know and understand, and the Jewish community should truly know and understand this better than anyone, that to take on one form of hate requires taking on all forms of hate. And all of our fates are so deeply intertwined here. And so, the three women leading this effort are three Jewish women. We are three white women, and we acknowledge that in the work that we do, and ensure that the case itself is being informed by brilliant advocates and experts of all backgrounds who know the landscape of white supremacy, the impacts of white supremacy, and as I believe someone spoke to earlier, the ways in which white supremacy, while it oftentimes breaks into the news only when there's a violent attack, is so deeply entrenched in our society in so many ways. And we're seeing that firsthand during coronavirus with the horrifying disparate impacts of the virus on communities of color and the socioeconomic differences at play here. And so we're we are starkly aware of that and something that we try to be cognizant of. Of course, our defendants don't love the fact that 3 Jewish women are leading this effort. They make that well known. And I would also note that our plaintiffs really truly represent the diversity of those who are the targets of white supremacists. They represent so many people from different backgrounds, and that's because Charlottesville itself is a community that represents the diversity of our country so well. We have a reverend, we have an African-American couple, we have Latinas, we have students and other UVA community members. We have folks of all different backgrounds. I mentioned earlier how the synagogue was targeted by the Nazis the morning of the Charlottesville attack. It's impossible to look at what happened in Charlottesville and not see the diversity of the communities who are impacted by white supremacy and the ways in which our fight against it and our fates here are also intertwined. So I really appreciate you raising that. It's something that we are deeply cognizant of, and something that our case, we think, truly illustrates in ways that hopefully will help shape a broader national conversation on this when we take it to trial this fall.
Thank you. I'm grouping kind of light questions together. So the next set of questions essentially asks this: how does Integrity First for America differ from the Southern Poverty Law Center? And then kind of a practical question: what court is your lawsuit in? Who are the judges there? We do a lot of work on judicial nominations here at NCJW, and do you feel like you have a fair, independent, diverse set of judges in front of you?
It's a great question. And personally, as someone who in my prior life worked in the New York Attorney General's office, I am deeply grateful for all the work NCJW does when it comes to the courts and ensuring a fair justice system. So thank you to all of you for your advocacy on that. We are in the Western District of Virginia in the federal courthouse there, the federal court there. The courthouse is quite literally in downtown Charlottesville. It's 2 blocks from Heather Heyer Way, where the car attack happened, a few blocks from the synagogue, a few blocks from Emancipation Park. And so we think that the trial itself will actually be so powerful because of the court that we're in. We are in the community that was attacked. Our jurors will come from the community that was attacked. And it's worth noting that these neo-Nazis and white supremacists almost none of them were actually from Charlottesville or even Virginia. So many of them came from the outside, from all across the country, to attack the Charlottesville community. And that's something that we think this community understands, they see, and will certainly be clear at trial. The judge assigned to us was a Bush 1 appointee named Norman Moon. We believe he has been eminently fair. Thus far, our case was filed originally in October of 2017, just a few months after the violence. Needless to say, when we go to trial this coming October, it will be 3 years since the case was originally filed, which really speaks to, I would say, the difficulty of taking people who don't believe in the rule of law or in basic human rights to court when you're dealing with neo-Nazis. It's like dealing with a bunch of sort of evil teenagers, some folks in our legal team like to say. And they have really tried every trick in the book to delay this case, to, in some cases, destroy evidence, at the very least, miraculously lose evidence, like the neo-Nazi who claimed his phone fell down the toilet. But we have been very proud by the rulings we've secured from the court that requires all of our defendants to turn over their phones, their computers, their social media accounts. And that evidence is obviously important to our case, to illustrating their conspiracy and the pre-planning that went into this. And we've also won sanctions from the court. So not only is the court making clear that these individuals and groups have to comply with their discovery obligations, but he's also starting to show them that there are real financial and legal consequences when they don't. I mentioned earlier that one was thrown in jail. A number have faced real financial penalties already through these various motions for sanctions our plaintiffs have filed. And so we are quite proud of that. We think the court has been quite fair, and we really look forward to presenting our case in front of a jury of people from the Western Virginia community who were attacked directly by these individuals. The other question was how we differ from the SPLC. And I will also add in a few other groups I'm frequently asked about, just to preempt some other questions. The SPLC has historically brought cases like this. And in fact, some of the cases that provide important precedent in ours were ones that the SPLC brought. Some of you might know of the Michael Donald case, in which the victim of Klan violence in the South in the 80s. His family brought a case on behalf, or rather against the Ku Klux Klan. His mother won, among other things, the title to the Tuscaloosa headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan in this now famous case. And it really illustrated the ways in which you could use civil litigation to take on and essentially bankrupt the assets of hate groups. And so Rachel Maddow did a fantastic segment. I think a few of folks from the IFA team are on the chat, and perhaps one of them can put it in the chat here. It's worth watching. The segment really details the extensive history of cases like ours that take on essentially the assets of these white supremacists with the goal of bankrupting and dismantling them like ours. So all of that to say, the SPLC has historically done some cases like that. Some might know that the SPLC has undergone some changes recently. We are working with them now, especially through their Hate Watch project and some of the great research that they do there. They have brought some smaller cases recently, including one against Andrew Anglin, who's also one of our defendants. But they, and frankly, no one else at this point has taken on the broader leadership of this movement. And so our case uniquely does that, partially because those chats that I described earlier truly provide a clear window into how they operated. We're also frequently asked about the ADL, as I can imagine folks might, I'm sure someone has already mentioned it on chat somewhere. We are formally partnering with the ADL in that they've invested directly in our case. They've invested $100,000 into our case, and we are working with their Center on Extremism more broadly, because much like the SPLC, they do extraordinary research on the white nationalist and white supremacist movement. And our case informs their work, and especially their research informs our case. And the fact that a nonprofit like the ADL thought it was so important to invest in our case, we believe is an important sign of the unique nature of the case and the importance of the lawsuit in the fight against these groups and these leaders. And then, of course, we're often asked about the ACLU as well, which is conflicted out of our case because they secured the original permit for the Unite the Right rally. They've since changed their policy on that, which folks there can certainly talk about as sort of someone who's a personal supporter of the ACLU. Obviously, they are an organization I and many of my colleagues respect greatly and have worked with in many other capacities. And while they can't be involved in our case directly, there are a number of folks who are deeply entrenched in civil liberties issues and are in former ACLU or current ACLU leader roles who are supportive of this case. And that's important because this is not a case about speech. This is not a case that's even about incitement. It's a case about a conspiracy to commit violence. And there's a clear line in the sand. And in fact, the judge in our case wrote as much in his decision rejecting the defendant's motion to dismiss, that the First Amendment does not protect the right to commit violence. And we believe that this case will outline that so clearly and make explicit the difference between neo-Nazis and other extremists' right to believe and to say the awful things they would like to believe and say, and the fact that they don't have a right to take those awful racist beliefs and turn them into real world violence.
Thank you. Another category of questions we're getting is totally to be expected from our amazing advocates. What can I do at home to combat white supremacy and anti-Semitism? What if white supremacists decide to march in my town? What should I do? So you have, nearly or more than 300 of us eager ears on the line here, and more who will watch this recording. What are some concrete steps we can take?
I'll start small in terms of specifically this case and what folks could do, because there's even so much you could do here, and then build out more broadly, because there's no shortage of actions folks can take. And I know that NCJW has already done incredible work on these issues. I know Sheila is passionate about it, and as are so many of the other staff members and members, so we are grateful for that. In terms of IFA in this case itself, let your networks know that this is happening. Right now, it's so easy to feel angry and scared and daunted by the crisis of extremism. This is a concrete, tangible thing that people can do to fight back against the leaders and the groups that are at the center of this movement. And by getting involved, by signing up on our website for case updates, if you folks are inclined to share it on social media, to donate, to host an event, whatever it is that motivates you, let us know and we will work with you to make that happen. We are doing a ton of virtual events like this. If your synagogue, your community center, or someone like that would like to host one, just let us know. We are happy to do so. And we think it's so important that people understand that there's a concrete, tangible way to fight back and to bankrupt and dismantle these groups through our justice system. We have rights, we have laws in the books that are meant to protect us. And even if our federal government won't necessarily use some of them to take on these groups, we will. And that's really important. However, as I said earlier, there's so much more that needs to happen to truly take on the crisis of white supremacy. From a policymaker perspective, there's some basic legislation. There's something called the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which is sort of a basic piece of legislation sponsored by Dick Durbin and a number of others that would close gaps in reporting, ensure that anti-white supremacy efforts are fully resourced, or at least more resourced than they currently are, ensure there's good cooperation between various levels of government, from the local to the state to the federal level. So there's some basic legislation that has stalled over the last few years that I think is a no-brainer. There's obviously broader conversations to be had, for example, about making passing a domestic terrorism statute, which is another conversation that should be had. There are, of course, some civil rights issues there in which folks are rightfully concerned that that statute could be abused to go after progressive groups that this administration doesn't like Black Lives Matter. And I think there needs to be an important discussion about that. But it's important to understand that we're not starting from really zero on this. We're sort of starting from below zero. And we've had a federal government that over the last few years has actively disinvested in combating extremism. DOJ civil rights investigations are down 2/3 over the last few years. DOJ Civil Rights Division was quite literally created to take on cases like the one we're doing. The Department of Homeland Security scrapped a domestic terror intelligence unit. And so while we've seen, especially since El Paso, important work by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies to go after these white supremacists, the power of the federal government is by no means behind them. In fact, resources have been taken away from the fight against white supremacy. And so it's important to understand that there's, from a policy perspective, so much more that can be done. There's, of course, also state versions of some of this legislation, and I would encourage you to figure out what's going on in your own state. In some states, attorneys general have power to do more on this, and others they don't. For example, I was in the New York Attorney General's office where the AG herself did not have much power to take on hate crimes, but could issue explicit guidance to law enforcement and local governments about their responsibilities to take on hate crimes. And even that is an important step. Of course, law enforcement, making sure that they are sufficiently going after these groups using the resources they do have. Just the other week, the State Department designated for the first time a white supremacist group as a foreign terror organization, a group called Russian Imperial Movement. Of course, you won't be surprised to learn that group has deep ties to some of our defendants, including Matthew Heimbach. This is a global movement, and over again, we see our defendants in the center of this movement. And so holding law enforcement accountable to their responsibilities under current resources. And then there's the private sector. As we've talked about, so much of this is happening online, and currently something called the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, means that social media companies face virtually zero liability for anything that happens on their platforms. And that means that Discord or Telegram or 4chan and 8chan or Gab or any of these sites that have in some cases built business models on allowing extremism to prosper face zero consequences. And this means that in some cases we have the private sector, we have specific social media companies and tech companies that are willing to do the right thing. In many we don't. And there needs to be a discussion about public policy changes to ensure these sites aren't becoming hotbeds of extremism. I feel like I've rambled on there a bit, but I will just say one last thing, which is that when we go to trial this fall, it will be a 3 to 5 week trial in which we put the leaders of this movement on the stand and lay bare how they operate, the hate and the violence at their core, and specifically the role of social media in planning their violence. And not only will that be so important for driving a public conversation on the rise of white supremacy, but we hope that at such a critical moment in our national conversation, when we're thinking about who we are as a country, the values that we represent, it will help inform a public policy conversation that continues well into 2021 and beyond. And taking off my C3 hat for just a second, allowing, perhaps new elected leaders in Washington to take the ball and run with it on an issue that is long overdue to be dealt with like this.
Thank you so much for those answers. And actually, I feel like when you took your C3 hat off, it was still very C3 friendly. So thank you. Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more quick question, and it's too bad because I have like 40 in the queue, and I apologize to everyone. Thank you for engaging and dropping your questions in the Q&A and the chat. This one came earlier in the presentation, and I can't resist it because it ties in with another one of NCJW's priority issues. And it says this: the tactics of far-right extremists, harassment, threats, and murder seem no different than the tactics that have been used for decades by anti-abortion domestic terrorists. Certainly some in the South have espoused anti-abortion policies to prevent replacement. Do you agree? If so, what can we take from your work dealing with white supremacists and neo-Nazis that we can apply to our work for reproductive rights and abortion access?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And it reminds me that I failed to note something about our case that I think this group would appreciate perhaps more than any we speak with, which is that the idea for our case came actually out of a case against a website called the Nuremberg Files in the 90s by some lawyers at Paul Weiss, which is Robbie Kaplan's old law firm. The Nuremberg Files was a site used by anti-abortion terrorists. There they listed the names, addresses, photos, and other information about doctors who performed abortion and other medical folks who performed abortion. And then when those individuals and clinics were targeted and in some cases even killed, they put a big red X through their names on the site. In that case, a number of reproductive health organizations sued the organizers of the site. They won massive civil judgments and were able to effectively shut down, bankrupt, and dismantle the terrorists that were behind it. And so the idea for this case in many ways came from that case. It was litigated by a lawyer named Marty London, who's one of Robbie's former colleagues. It's a fascinating case. I would encourage folks to look it up, the Nuremberg Files, because again, everything ties back to the Nazis, even if you're talking about abortion or white supremacy or everything in between. And so I think I'm sad that I forgot to mention that earlier because it's such a perfect anecdote for this group and one that I know you will all appreciate. So in many ways, the fight for reproductive rights helped inform the genesis of this case. And it again speaks to exactly what the person who asked the question got at, which is that these tactics are so similar. These are not people who have any intent of simply using their First Amendment rights to protest. They intend to terrorize, they intend to bring violence to communities. There's also a much broader conversation that I don't think we have time for right now about the deep intersection between white supremacy and misogyny. There's been a lot written on that, including a great ADL report, a number of writings by folks like Jessica Valenti and others who dive into it in a way that is so powerful and so important. And I think many on this call won't be surprised to learn that some of our defendants, for example, someone who goes by Augustus Invictus, was recently arrested for, among other things, domestic violence and kidnapping related to his wife. And so just as in so many other incidences of violence, misogyny, domestic violence are early indicators when it comes to white supremacy. And as you can imagine, many of them are also deeply connected to the anti-reproductive health and anti-choice movement. And so there's both a direct connection in the genesis of our case and looking at the precedent set by the Nuremberg Files case, and similarly the assumed and very clear connections between our defendants in the broader movement and the anti-choice movement.
Thank you so much. So I heard that Robbie Kaplan is actually on. I figure maybe she can turn on her, or she can identify herself by chatting the panelists. We can turn on our video and just say thank you. Robbie Kaplan is a bit of an NCJW hero, as Amy, I think you are also shaping up to be.
Hey everyone, so sorry about that.
No, not at all. Robbie, thank you so much for all the work that you do. If folks are okay staying on for 2 more minutes, is there any 1 minute something you'd like to add? I know you haven't had the opportunity to hear our conversation so far, but we're all ears.
Well, I mean, what kept me, and I'm sorry I'm late, is that I'm the chair of the board at Time's Up, and there was a lot to talk about on our board meeting for Time's Up. And I overheard what Faith and Amy were just saying, which is there is no doubt that the kind of anti-Semitism and hatred and violent hatred that we are dealing with in our Charlottesville case is intimately, and I use the word intimately on purpose, connected to misogyny and violence against women. The same people who have the views that Jews should be in the ovens believe that they have an absolute right to rape their wives and act that way frequently. So intersectionality is true, and it seems particularly true in this realm of hatred and violence, is horrible as that concept may be.
Thank you for that, Robbie. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to Paula to close us out, right on time as it happens. So thank you.
Yes, we're at the end of our time together. I really want to thank each of our speakers, Amy and Kathy, and Robbie, thank you for coming on.
I'm so sorry again.
We're glad you joined us, that's for sure. What we heard this afternoon was sobering, but it was also inspiring because you shared with us what we can do in our communities to fight back against white supremacy and anti-Semitism and bankrupt those hate groups. So I want to thank you for that. And thanks to the hundreds of folks who joined us this afternoon on this webinar. The recording of the webinar will be shared with everybody who registered in the next few days, and it'll be posted on the NCJW website. There are a couple of more seminars coming in. I feel like I'm giving a little bit of a commercial here, but there's a couple of more exciting activities this month. On May 20th, NCJW and partners are holding a Vote Safe Digital Lobby Day, and you see it on your screen, from 12 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, to let our lawmakers know that we shouldn't have to choose between our health and our democracy. You can sign up at www.ncjw, as you can see on the screen, to get everything you need to participate. It's also available on our homepage. And then on May 26th at 4:30, we're going to have our next webinar in this series, which is launching NCJW's Abortion and Jewish Values Toolkit. Please stay well, everyone. Stay safe. And we hope to see you again next week. And thank you. Thank you for coming this afternoon.